What if the most powerful navy in the world just moved 20 ships through Iran's front door and Iran never saw them coming? Somewhere in these waters, right now, something else is missing too. An Iranian ship. Gone. And nobody in Tehran can explain how. Before we go further, if this story pulls you in even a little, do something small for me. Hit that subscribe button, tap like, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is over. That one share is how this channel grows, and it costs you nothing. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, not just on a map, but in the real-world economy that touches your life every single day. It is a narrow channel of water, only about 21 miles wide at its tightest point, sitting between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. It looks small on a map. It is anything but small in reality. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil, and close to that same share of the world's liquefied natural gas, has historically passed through this one strip of water. Every tanker leaving Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, and the UAE has to sail through this exact channel to reach the open ocean. There is no easy way around it. For decades, whoever could threaten this strait could threaten the entire global economy without firing a single missile beyond its shores. That is exactly why, for almost 6 months now, the world has been watching one narrow stretch of water more closely than almost anywhere else on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its tightest point, a thin blue line between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that somehow decides the price of gas at your local station, the cost of shipping a package, and whether entire economies stay calm or start to panic. Since the end of February this year, this strait has been a battlefield in every sense but name. The United States and Israel launched a massive air campaign against Iran. Iran's own supreme leader was killed in that opening strike, and Iran, wounded but not silenced, answered the only way it had left. It turned the strait into a weapon. Mines in the water. Missiles fired at tankers. Ships boarded, crews taken, vessels set ablaze. For a country that had just watched its top leadership wiped out in days, controlling this waterway became the last card left to play, and Iran played it hard. For months, Iranian officials stood in front of cameras and said the same thing over and over. Nothing moves through the Strait of Hormuz without our permission. It became almost a national slogan, repeated by naval commanders, repeated by state media, repeated until it started to sound less like a threat and more like a mantra. A country trying to convince the world and maybe itself that it still held the keys to one of the most important waterways on the planet. And for a while, the numbers backed that story up. Shipping traffic through the strait fell to a fraction of what it used to be. Before this war, roughly 130 ships passed through every single day, carrying about a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas. After Iran shut the door, some weeks saw barely a dozen ships willing to risk the crossing. Tankers stacked up outside the strait by the hundreds, waiting, watching, hoping the water would calm. Global oil prices spiked. Governments around the world started talking openly about a fuel crisis. Iran's threat was not just talk, it was working. Think about what that fear actually did to the rest of the world. Insurance costs for tankers willing to attempt the crossing shot through the roof, with some ships reportedly earning $500,000 a day just for taking the risk. Governments from Asia to Europe started scrambling for alternative energy sources. Fuel prices climbed at gas. Stations thousands of miles away from this stretch of water, in countries that had nothing to do with the war itself. This is the strange power of a choke point like Hormuz. A handful of mines and a wave of threats in one small channel can ripple outward and touch nearly every economy on the planet within days. Iran understood that power better than almost anyone, and for months it used it as skillfully as it could. But something changed. Quietly, without a press conference, without a headline shouting across every network at once, the United States began building something underneath all that noise, a shadow operation. And over the last several weeks, that operation has grown into something that undercuts everything Iran has been telling its own people for half a year. According to two officials who spoke to Axios, the United States has quietly built a working shipping corridor through the Strait of Hormuz, and it has been running for weeks without most of the world noticing. Every night, quietly and without fanfare, somewhere between 15 and 20 tankers slip through the southern channel of the strait, hugging the Omani coastline, moving in tightly organized groups. One long line heading out, one long line heading in, timed, scheduled, escorted. This is not luck. This is not a handful of brave captains rolling the dice. This is a coordinated military and commercial operation, run night after night on a schedule with American fighter jets flying overhead to intercept any Iranian drone or missile that dares to get close. And it has apparently been happening for weeks, while Iran kept telling its people the strait belonged to them. Here's where it gets even more interesting. This entire corridor only became possible because of something that happened just before it started. A 2-week American military campaign that specifically targeted Iran's coastal radar stations, its command centers, and its surveillance systems along the strait. Strike after strike, night after night, aimed not at tanks or troops, but at Iran's eyes, its ability to see what was happening on its own coastline. By the time that campaign ended, Iran's radar coverage over the southern channel of the strait had been badly degraded, which means when those 15 to 20 tankers started moving each night, a large portion of that traffic simply never showed up on Iranian screens. Not because Iran chose to look away, because Iran, for long stretches at a time, could no longer see. Think about what that actually means. For 6 months, Iran's entire bargaining position, the fear it used to pressure the world, the leverage it used in every negotiation, rested on one single idea. We control this water. Nothing moves without us knowing. And now, night after night, ships are moving in numbers large enough to matter, and Iran's own surveillance simply cannot track them. The scale of this is not small either. According to Central Command, the U.S. military has now helped move more than 660 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz since early May. That is not a typo. 660 million barrels. The military says it has assisted roughly 1,300 commercial vessels through the strait over that same stretch of time. On some of the strongest nights, the flow has reportedly reached 15 to 20 million barrels in a single 24-hour window. Compare that to what Iran is dealing with on its own side of the ledger. U.S. forces have reimposed a naval blockade specifically targeting Iranian ports, both inside and outside the strait. Since that blockade went back into effect in the middle of July, American forces have redirected more than 50 commercial vessels tied to Iran, disabled several, and boarded at least 2, all in an effort to choke off the flow of Iranian oil leaving through its own coastline. One of those vessels, according to reports, was part of what analysts call Iran's shadow fleet, a network of tankers that deliberately avoid tracking systems and shipping lanes to move sanctioned oil without being noticed. That ship was intercepted, and its journey was rewritten by men who were not supposed to be there at all. Let that sink in for a moment. On one side of this story, American convoys are moving through the strait almost every single night, protected, organized, and largely unseen by Iranian radar. On the other side, Iran's own ships, the ones meant to keep its economy breathing, are being stopped, boarded, and turned away. Both of these things are happening in the exact same stretch of water that Iran has spent half a year insisting belongs entirely to them. There is also the matter of that missing vessel, the one we mentioned at the very start of this video. Iran's shadow fleet has always operated on a simple principle: staying invisible. These are tankers that switch off their tracking systems, avoid recognized shipping lanes, and disguise their movements specifically so that nobody, not satellites, not naval patrols, not international regulators, can easily follow where they go. It is how Iran has managed to keep selling oil despite years of sanctions. It is a system built entirely around not being seen. So when one of those ships was located, boarded, and redirected with this kind of precision, the message underneath it was louder than the incident itself. If a fleet designed to disappear can still be found, tracked, and taken, then the entire foundation that fleet depends on is no longer as solid as Iran needs it to be. A ship built to vanish did not vanish from the people looking for it. It vanished from Iran instead, taken by hands Tehran never saw reaching for it. If you are just joining this channel tonight, welcome. This is the kind of story we chase down here, the one buried underneath the daily headlines, the pattern nobody else is connecting yet. If that sounds like your kind of channel, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means we get to keep doing this work. So go ahead, tap it now before you forget, and let's keep going. So why does any of this matter beyond the numbers? Because oil is not just money for Iran, it is survival. Iran's president himself admitted it publicly just days ago, saying plainly that the country's revenues have collapsed because it can no longer sell its oil the way it used to. When a government loses its main source of income, it does not just lose comfort. It loses the ability to pay its soldiers, fund its security services, and keep the machinery of the state running smoothly. Oil money is not a luxury for Tehran right now. It is oxygen. And it is not only the strait that is being squeezed. Reports indicate that Iran's oil exports to China, historically its largest and most important customer, have also been significantly disrupted. When your biggest buyer stops buying at the same time your home waters stop working for you, the pressure does not stay in one place. It spreads through everything, through wages, through fuel prices at home, through the loyalty of the people who are supposed to enforce the regime's authority. Money problems in a government at war are never just about money. They tend to become problems about power itself. At the same time, something else has been quietly happening far away from the strait, something that matters just as much in the long run. The world has been building alternatives. The Keystone Pipeline, long shut down, has been reopened to move oil more directly from Canada to the United States. Oil imports from Venezuela into the U.S. have jumped to their highest levels in years. And the United Arab Emirates has been racing to finish a pipeline specifically designed to move oil around the strait entirely, bypassing it altogether. None of these projects happened by accident, and none of them happened overnight. They represent a slow, deliberate effort to make the Strait of Hormuz less essential to the global economy than it has ever been before. Think about what that means for Iran's long game. Even if, someday, Iran manages to regain some kind of control over these waters, the prize itself may be worth less by the time it gets there. The world is quietly building its way around Iran's biggest piece of leverage, one pipeline and one alternative route at a time. It is a slow bleed, not a single knockout blow, but slow bleeds are often the ones that change history the most. It is worth stepping back here and looking at how the rest of the region is reacting, because Iran is not the only country watching this unfold. The United Arab Emirates has publicly accused Iran's Revolutionary Guard of what it called piracy, saying the campaign against commercial shipping amounts to economic coercion and blackmail. Saudi Arabia has quietly welcomed any diplomatic effort that promises to restore calm to these waters, understanding better than most just how much its own economy depends on this strait staying open and predictable. Even countries with no ships in these waters at all, nations thousands of miles away that simply buy oil on the global market, have felt the price swings every time tensions here spike. When a choke point this important becomes unstable, nobody nearby gets to stay a neutral bystander for very long. Everyone in the region has a stake in how this ends, and everyone is watching to see whether Iran's grip on this water is truly slipping, or whether this is simply one more turn in a war that has already produced plenty of surprises. Meanwhile, Iranian officials continue to insist, publicly and repeatedly, that any provocative move by the United States in these waters will be met with an immediate and decisive response. That kind of language has not changed in 6 months. What has changed is how much weight that language still carries when it runs directly against nightly evidence of tankers moving unharmed and unnoticed. Threats only work when the other side believes they can actually be carried out. Every convoy that crosses safely quietly chips away at how much anyone still believes Iran's warnings are backed by real capability. Now here's the part that should genuinely make you pause. This is not one operation. It is at least 3, running side by side, each one grinding away at a different piece of Iran's position. The first is military. Strikes on radar stations, ongoing air patrols, fighter jets escorting convoys through waters Iran once called untouchable. The second is economic. A blockade on Iranian ports, redirected vessels, disrupted exports to China, a government publicly admitting its revenue has dried up. The third is strategic and long-term. New pipelines, new routes, new suppliers, all quietly reducing how much the world actually needs this one strip of water that Iran has staked its entire remaining leverage on. None of these 3 fronts alone would be enough to break Iran's position completely. A single blocked pipeline, a single degraded radar station, none of that decides a war on its own. But layered together, running for months at a time, feeding off each other night after night, they add up to something much bigger than the sum of their parts. This is not a single dramatic strike meant to end the story in one headline. This looks like patience. It looks like a strategy built to wear a country down slowly, on multiple fronts at once, until the gap between what it claims and what is actually true becomes impossible to hide. And that gap is the real story here, isn't it? For 6 months, Iran told its people, and told the world, that it held the keys to the Strait of Hormuz. That belief was not just propaganda. It was the foundation of everything Iran has done since this war began. Every threat, every negotiation, every act of defiance rested on that single idea. We control this water, but convoys are moving. Oil is flowing. Iranian ships are being turned away from their own ports. And somewhere out there, an Iranian vessel that was supposed to be untouchable simply vanished, taken by people it never saw coming. None of that fits the story Iran has been telling. Not even close. So here's the real question worth sitting with tonight. What happens to a government's authority when the story it tells its own people stops matching the reality happening right outside its coastline? Regimes do not usually collapse the moment they lose a battle. They start to crack when their own citizens can no longer believe the things they are being told. When the fishermen on the coast can see foreign convoys passing freely at night. When the oil workers know exactly how much money has stopped coming in. When soldiers who used to be told they were untouchable start hearing whispers about ships that disappeared without a fight. That kind of gap does not close on its own. It either forces a government to change course, to admit weakness, and adapt, or it keeps widening quietly in the dark until something breaks under the pressure. History has shown us both outcomes before. And right now, nobody can say with certainty which direction Iran is heading. But the direction of travel, based on everything unfolding in these waters right now, does not favor the story Tehran has been selling. There's also a quieter, more human side to all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines. Every barrel of oil that Iran cannot sell is money that does not reach ordinary Iranian families. Every redirected vessel is a delay that ripples through markets, through workers, through households already stretched thin by years of sanctions and now months of open war. The people living through this are not abstractions on a shipping chart. They are families watching their currency lose value a little more each week, watching prices climb at local markets, wondering whether the government's promises about controlling these waters were ever really true, or whether they were simply what people in power say when they need everyone else to keep believing in them a little longer. If you have made it this far into the video, you already understand something most people watching the news tonight do not. This is not really a story about ships or oil barrels. It is a story about the space between what a government claims and what is actually true, and how long that space can stretch before it finally snaps. If that idea means something to you, this is the moment to hit, like on this video. Drop a single word in the comments telling me where you're watching from tonight. And stick around, because we are not finished yet. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it explains how any of this became physically possible in the first place. None of these convoys could move safely without serious protection in the sky above them. American F-16s have been flying regular patrols over the Gulf of Oman, armed specifically with laser-guided rockets built to intercept small, fast-moving threats like Iranian drones. Each of these rockets costs a fraction of what older, heavier interceptor missiles used to cost, which matters enormously. When you're trying to sustain an operation like this for months at a time without draining your own resources, cheap interceptors against cheap drones, a war of economics as much as firepower, backing those fighters up are aerial refueling planes, keeping jets in the sky for hours longer than they could manage alone, and high-altitude surveillance drones watching the coastline from tens of thousands of feet up, feeding real-time information down to pilots and to warships equipped with advanced radar systems. None of these pieces work in isolation. Together they form something closer to a single connected nervous system stretched across air, sea, and surveillance all at once. A ship's radar sees something, a drone confirms it, a fighter jet responds, all in the span of moments, all feeding into the same shared picture. What makes this system genuinely different from earlier phases of the war is how sustainable it is. Wars are not only won by what side has the more powerful weapon in a single moment, they are shaped by which side can keep paying the bill night after night, month after month, without running out of resources or patience. A cheap rocket that reliably brings down a cheap drone lets you fly that mission again tomorrow, and the night after that, and the month after that, without the cost eventually forcing a change in strategy. Iran, by contrast, is trying to defend an enormous stretch of coastline with a surveillance network that keeps taking direct hits, using resources that keep shrinking as its oil revenue keeps falling. One side is building a system designed to last. The other is trying to hold a position it can no longer clearly see, using money it increasingly does not have. That is the real engine behind these convoys moving safely night after night. It is not one clever trick. It is a fully built system, patient, layered, and quietly humming along in the background while the public conversation stays focused on headlines and threats. And on the other side of that system sits a country whose radar stations have been struck, whose command centers have been degraded, and whose own coastline has become harder for its own military to watch clearly. There is something almost quiet about how this entire shift has unfolded. No dramatic victory speech, no single battle that changed everything overnight, just weeks of steady, grinding pressure applied consistently, until one day the numbers simply stopped matching the story. 20 tankers moving safely in a single night, 660 million barrels moved since early May, 50 vessels tied to Iran redirected since the blockade returned in July, an Iranian president admitting on camera that the money has stopped coming in. None of these facts, on their own, sound like the ending of anything. But stacked together, night after night, they start to look exactly like that. So where does this actually leave Iran? Almost certainly, the public claims will continue. Regimes rarely announce their own weakening out loud, especially not in the middle of a war they are still trying to survive. Expect the same language, the same warnings about red lines and sovereignty, the same insistence that nothing moves without permission. That pattern is held for 6 months, and there is little reason to think it stops now, whatever is actually happening on the water. But patterns like that only hold for so long before reality forces its way through. Every additional convoy that slips through unnoticed, every additional barrel that reaches the market without Iran's involvement, every additional vessel redirected or boarded, every new pipeline that quietly reduces how much the world needs this strait at all. Each one chips away, just slightly, at the story Iran has been telling since the very first week of this war. And somewhere in that widening gap between claim and reality lies the real answer to the question this entire story keeps circling back to. not whether Iran will keep saying it controls these waters, because it almost certainly will. The real question is how much longer anyone at home or abroad keeps believing it. Power that has to be constantly announced is usually power that is already slipping away. And right now, in the dark water of the Strait of Hormuz, night. After night, that slipping is happening in plain sight, whether Tehran is ready to admit it or not. Consider how strange this moment actually is when you say it out loud. A government that just months ago promised to turn the strait into what one of its own former officials called a massacre for anyone who dared to cross it is now watching 20 tankers slide past its coastline in a single night, protected, organized, and completely out of reach. That is not a small shift. That is the sound of a threat losing its teeth in real time, even as the words used to make that threat stay exactly the same. Words are cheap when the water tells a different story every single night. There's an old idea in military history worth remembering here. Empires and regimes rarely fall because of the battle everyone remembers. They fall because of the 100 smaller moments nobody was watching closely enough. The missed convoy, the silent radar screen, the ship that vanished without a fight, quietly stacking up until the final collapse looks sudden to everyone except the people who were paying attention the whole time. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now may end up being one of those quiet moments. Not the headline that defines this war in textbooks, but one of the small, steady cracks that made the ending possible. The kind of detail future analysts point back to and say, that was the moment everything really started to turn, even though almost nobody noticed it happening at the time. History tends to remember moments like this one differently than they felt while they were happening. At the time, it probably just looked like another quiet night on the water. Another convoy moving under cover of darkness, another ship redirected without much fuss. But zoom out, and you start to see the actual shape of what occurred here. A regime that staked its entire remaining leverage on a single narrow stretch of water, slowly losing its grip on that same water, one unnoticed convoy at a time, until the gap between its words and its reality became too wide to close. That is how power actually erodes in the real world. Not always. With a single dramatic collapse that makes every front page at once, but sometimes with 20 tankers moving quietly past a coastline that was supposed to be watching and finding nothing there to stop them. It happens one ordinary night at a time, one uneventful convoy at a time, until enough ordinary nights pile up that the whole picture finally comes into focus. And by then, the outcome already feels inevitable, even though it never announced itself in advance. If this story mattered to you tonight, if it made you see this conflict a little differently than the headlines have been telling it, then do one last thing before you go. Subscribe to this channel, because the next chapter of this story is coming, whether it is a diplomatic breakthrough, a fresh escalation, or another quiet operation nobody sees until it is already finished. And you will not want to hear about it secondhand from someone else's headline. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next report.